Well, let me just start by thanking Alison Christian and the Tax Justice Network and all of the great Canadian organizations that put this together. We've been working on the links between tax justice, fiscal justice, and human rights for some time, and I feel that this session and this whole event is really a coming out party and the beginning of something very special that's been a long time coming, and now we've broken the surface, and now it's time to really blossom. So, what I wanted to discuss a little bit was some of our work in bringing human rights to bear in the debates around sustainable development financing. We are an NGO based in New York that, since the economic crisis in particular, but even before that, we've been looking into the human rights consequences of fiscal austerity, of unjust fiscal policies, but more than just the human rights consequences, looking into how existing human rights law at the domestic and international level and principles can help frame the creation, the design, and implementation of tax policies, laws, and practices to really bring these norms into play in the real political economy. So first, just this was mentioned before, human rights and tax is a long time coming. This is over 200 years ago. I won't go into detail on this, but it's just to say that the norms are there and are developing. The question is, how do we put it into practice? And in the context of the French Declaration, I think we can see that tax policy was seen in a sense as an emancipatory project. It's a battleground of liberation, not as some opaque technical process. So our national level work to advance fiscal justice through human rights really informs everything we do. Here is an example that comes up very often in our national level work, is the question of sufficiency of resources. Governments across the world, north and south, when we approach them around their obligations to fulfill economic and social rights, they very often say, well, we don't have enough money to do so. So interrogating that claim, is there sufficiency of resources? In Spain and Ireland, I'm sorry this is very tiny, but in Spain and Ireland where we worked, you see at the top here, the left axis is the Gini coefficient in inequality, the bottom axis is total government revenue as a percentage of GDP. Interesting correlation there. Just this is the beginning of asking the question whether Spain and Ireland are actually raising sufficient revenue to meet human rights needs. This is another example, working in partnership with tax justice advocates and the Union of Tax Inspectors in Spain. In 2012, this is just an illustration of the difference between tax evasion and budget cuts in Spain. The small red circle here are national budget cuts between 2011 and 2012 of 27.3 billion. The next circle on the outside is the potential estimated revenue gained by combating tax evasion that same year. And of course, moving out further, the total revenue loss to tax evasion, 88 billion, and then the total public deficit just out there. So you see that just by fighting tax evasion in 2012, the government could have recouped and offset the need for all of the budget cuts in that country. So interrogating this question of insufficiency of resources is critical. The next question is the equality of resources and equitable use and generation of those resources. Does tax policy discriminate against certain people, and is it used in a way that tackles different types of socioeconomic inequality? This is an example in Guatemala. You see on the left here, this is the incidence of income tax. It seems quite fair, but it's actually used quite little, or was when we worked with the Guatemalans. To the right is the value-added tax. And you can see that this is the smallest quintile here. The poorest quintile here faces the biggest burden of the value-added tax. And the value-added tax beats all of the others in the room from before. It's 75% of total tax revenue comes from the VAT tax when we worked there in 2008, 2009. So the question there is, who is the government raising its resources from, and is that fighting tax inequality? How does that discriminate against particular people and their income base? Another question here is how resources are spent. This is just an example of looking at the percentage of poor people by population. The poorest areas of Guatemala is in Quiché over here, and looking at that against the spending on health by population. This is Guatemala City up here as the outlier. We can see here that even the poorest of the poor are not getting anywhere near the resources that the richest parts of the country get. And beyond the question of sufficiency of resources and equality of resources is the question of accountability, fiscal accountability of resources. Is it transparent? Is it participatory? Is it accountable and subject to public review and judicial review? This is an example in Egypt, which we have been working in over the past year or so. In 2010, the Open Budget Index for Egypt dropped through the floor, really. That's that red line right there. From a human rights perspective, there's a right to participation, a right to transparency and information, and a right to remedy or accountability. So these are questions that come up at the national level. So taking this framework of sufficiency, equality, and accountability, how does that apply to the way we monitor government's compliance with economic and social rights? We've developed this into some of our monitoring tools. This one we call OPRA, Outcomes, Policy Efforts, Resources, and Assessments. All of these particular types of monitoring government's compliance with the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights stem from those obligations. Resources in particular, we look at evaluating resource allocation, the resource generation, and analyzing budget processes. Again, all of this is buttressed in existing human rights law and is existing duties on governments. Then the next question is, how can we apply this to sustainable development financing? You may know that the Millennium Development Goals are coming to an end next year. The question after that is what succeeds it. There is widespread consensus that it will be a set of sustainable development goals, which not only looks at poverty, but looks at economic, environmental, and social pillars of sustainable development for present and future generations. And the UN is in heightened debate about this question. But looking beyond poverty, looking into an ambitious agenda, the question becomes, how do you finance that? The MDGs faced an annual $120 billion financing gap. And that was one of the main reasons, amongst others, that the MDGs weren't reached. The SDGs, well, it's very difficult to make estimates because there have been no conclusions on the agreements. They will almost certainly require $1 trillion per year. If you're looking at climate change mitigation and adaptation, you're looking at dealing with oceans, forests, marine diversity, as well as fighting inequality, poverty alleviation, etc. So the question here becomes, who's going to pay for this? Is it public financing? Is it private financing? And what are the risks of ceding the financing debate to the private sector? And what are the principles that we use to decide how this is paid for? Is it a philanthropy model, like the MDGs basically was, that those enlightened governments that have more money will give money to the poor and alleviate poverty? Or there are other principles we can think of stemming from the human rights traditions. Thinking of the principle of solidarity, we are all human beings, we all have needs, or the question of justice. And in what ways do certain governments' policies and laws undercut the ability of other governments to deliver those needs? This is something coming out of the human rights tradition. The other questions to ask: who's going to pay the burden? Who will bear the burden, of financing sustainable development? Who's going to truly benefit? And who's going to decide? So what we've tried to do is just, in essence, look at first sufficiency, then equality, and then accountability. So the sufficiency of financing for sustainable development, we know very well a lot of these domestic barriers in the countries we've seen and that have been pointed out throughout the last few days. Weak tax collection, rampant tax evasion, secretive, often regressive tax incentives and tax exemptions, deficiencies in enforcement of tax obligations, insufficient application of progressive income and capital taxes, and low tax morale is all big barriers. The global barriers are many. We've discussed them already: offshore secrecy and under-resourced public revenue institutions, and of course tax competition. As a systemic issue, we know that corporate tax rates worldwide have gone down on average from 38% to 24.9%, and that's the statutory rate, not even the effective rate. We looked into these questions, and we found that through a number of these illustrative measures, we could get to $1.5 trillion annual public financing, which is completely predictable and doesn't threaten other macroeconomic objectives. I don't have time to go into this, but this is something that's been on the radar for many years: taxing illicit financial flows, returning stolen assets, canceling odious debt, taxing carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. You can look at all of this in our latest publication, Post-2015 Fiscal Revolution. The next question becomes the equality and the burdens and benefits of sustainable development financing. And the tax side, we know there are many barriers to equality in how revenue is raised. There's a preference for indirect taxes, a hollowing out of progressive direct taxes, especially on high-income earners and capital gains. Global barriers, inequality between countries is really reinforced by capital outflows from low and middle-income countries into rich countries. On the expenditure side, there are also big barriers, in particular since the economic crisis, deepening fiscal austerity, which is next to worldwide now, not just playing out in Europe, and compounded by an uneven capacity and efficiency of public service delivery. Accountable fiscal governance is also very much at threat and has been a long-time barrier. Curtailed transparency at the domestic level prevents people to access information about the fiscal and financial policies of their government. It kind of mutes, as someone's a mutism, it mutes the ability of civil society to get into this debate because we don't have the basic information. This also applies at the global level, the incredible lack of transparency on basic fiscal and bank information at the international level. Meaningful participation, which is a human right protected under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, is also a big barrier, especially in tax and fiscal policy. And accountability is another big issue. Fiscal policy is not generally subjected to public or judicial oversight, though a lot of us are working towards that and trying to explore where there are avenues to use these type of judicial and non-judicial mechanisms to hold fiscal policymakers to account. But this is a big question, and especially since in times of crisis, governments have a tendency really to collapse all the decision-making around a small group of people. We saw that after September 11th. All of the executive power was reaffirmed. We saw that during the economic crisis in 2008, where decision-making had to be done in rapid procession. We know some of the opaque processes at the international level, and there is an astounding lack of impact assessments, looking at the impacts of human rights, environmental, gender, and other equality impacts of tax and fiscal policy. So we tried to look at this and say, okay, how can we revert this and use the debate and the momentum around this post-2015 sustainable development idea to get some hooks in it, because the targets and indicators, the type of decisions that are made at the UN over the next year or so are going to have impacts over the next 15 years, from 2015 until 2030. And so we want to make sure that there are levers in there to strengthen our fiscal justice work. And so there are many ways, four ways to do this. We've seen through the design of the goals, targets, and indicators, which I'm going to discuss a little bit later to conclude, how the strategy around financing is done. There's also a lot of discussion you may hear about a data revolution to try and strengthen statistical capacities, in particular to draw out where there are inequalities, vertical and horizontal in society. How can we use that momentum and that money around the data revolution to kick up a lot of this data we need on fiscal and tax issues? And there's going to be a framework of accountability built into the post-2015 framework. How can we make sure that they're looking at fiscal policy when holding governments to account to these commitments? What we did is we took the kind of the idea of sustainable development goals, targets, and indicators, and produced some targets and indicators of our own. I don't have a lot of time to go into this in detail, unfortunately, but I really encourage you to look online, and we have it in paper form here at our publication, because this is the beginning of something. It's not the end. We're proposing a set of targets and indicators on sufficiency of resources, on equality of resources, on accountability of resources at the domestic and international level. And we really need your help, in particular because some of these data sources are solid, many of them are not. Some of these indicators we think are really solid, others aren't. And so please come to me afterwards if you want to get engaged. This is a live mapping. We have it as a Google Doc, and we want people to engage in this conversation. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to talking to you.